Well, this week on the agenda, we saw possible solutions for eradicating poverty, a look at wars, and the comeback of the Celtic Kid. The agenda's Week in Review begins with Senator Hugh Siegel on his decades-long fight for a guaranteed annual income.
I said decades long. How many years you actually been at this?
It was a Tory, excuse the expression, thinkers conference in 1969 in Niagara Falls, where a paper was brought forward by a young research director by the name of Keith Banting, who went on to become the director of the School of Policy Studies at Queen's, where he suggested that the inefficiency in the welfare system, the difficulties with employment insurance, the mix between income security and sort of bridging between jobs really required a new approach. And he suggested that in a working paper, that a basic income floor, a refundable tax credit or guaranteed annual income, all the same, is something the party should give real thought to. And I've been a fan of that from that very moment.
So you heard that idea 43 years ago and have been championing it ever since.
I had hair then, so it was easier.
How much have the yardsticks moved at all since then?
I think there is some encouragement to be found when Ontario in the mid-70s brought in the guaranteed annual income supplement under one of the more conservative treasurers, Darcy McHugh and Mr. Davis. That created for senior citizens above a certain age an absolute guarantee of a minimum income just by filing their tax. No special programs, no being interviewed by welfare officers, but an absolute basic income, which in that context lowered the level of poverty for senior women, who are mostly the makeup of the population above 65 back then, from 34% to under 5% in less than 2 years. That was progress. That then spread to other provinces, and the federal government brought it in a different way. So we do have that measure of protection for our seniors, and that I think is hopeful. I think we've seen other programs brought in by different administrations. The Whitby program brought in, the Working Tax Benefit program brought in by Minister Flaherty, is an effort at least to protect the working poor, to encourage them to stay in the workforce and keep more of what they earn, which I think is very, very constructive. So there are small reeds in the wind that are hopeful, but overall, the core commitment to a pettifogging bureaucracy in the bureaucratic approach to welfare, which diminishes poor people, which doesn't treat them with respect, which asks a series of nanny state questions about their lives, still continues in most of our provinces, and I think that is very much against the process of eradicating poverty. That is really about institutionalizing poverty and keeping people trapped in a web they cannot break out of, and I think we have to rearrange how we go at that.
Can we put this poster up and look at the monitor over my shoulder, if you like, Senator Siegel? This was something that somebody who posted to the Globe and Mail's website said less than a year ago. It's a utopian dream. If you brought in a guaranteed annual income, a lot of taxpayers would decide not to work. It's that simple. If you had a good job but were only earning $25,000 a year, but you knew that the GAI was $20,000, would you not quit your job? Cut back a little? Just go with the flow? That's from Liz. What do you say to Liz?
I would say to Liz that the presumption in that is that people who are on welfare are glad to be on welfare. They'd rather be receiving help from someone else than earning their own living and making their own way in the world and doing better. There's no evidence to back that up.
Okay, let's go around on this. Andrew, guaranteed annual income. You like?
I like a lot of parts of it, a lot of aspects of it. So the basic idea of obviously of the state has an obligation to make sure nobody falls below a certain basic minimum, I like. And in fact, I would replace the current minimum wage with a minimum income guarantee. Secondly, I think the idea of trying to withdraw benefits very gradually as income rises is absolutely fundamental to any welfare reform. I mean, the person you quoted earlier who had written into the Globe and Mail, I would say to her is at the kinds of levels of income anybody's talking about with a guaranteed annual income, and at the kinds of effective tax rates that recipients are now facing with not only with withdrawal of cash support, but also withdrawal of certain benefits as their income rises. The real disincentive to work there is not giving money to people who don't work, it's taking it away from them when they do. And that's what you're really trying to correct. Giving people cash, benefits in cash rather than in kind, I think has a lot to recommend. It give people the choices as to how they spend the money rather than only getting what the welfare bureaucracy tells them they have to have. And finally, delivering it through the tax system and moving it up to the federal level has a lot to recommend it, because you can have a much more integrated welfare to work type of system. The only point where I pause is, can you do the big bang that a lot of guaranteed annual income people are talking about, where you scrap a lot of other programs and and replace it all with this one guarantee. Should you? Because some of those things, it's easy to say in the abstract, but when you look at specific programs, you might want to say, well, actually, that does address a certain need in a particular way that we don't want to get rid of. And if you don't scrap all those programs and you try to deliver a generous basic minimum and a very gradual withdrawal rate, you get into very high costs. So it's a hard nut to crack, is to balance all those different concerns so that you get a system that achieves all the things we're talking about, but doesn't do so at just enormous astronomic costs.
Lots of things to follow up on there, which we shall during the course of this. Armin, in one of your tweets, you apparently wrote, guaranteed annual income, an idea that never seems to go away, but never quite arrives. How come?
It's just one of these ideas that is very challenging. Everybody wants to do something to prevent people from just falling off the planet when things don't come together properly. And I can't say how much I appreciate the senator's championship of this issue. The fact that it is a conservative senator that is championing the need to do something about the growing inequality in this nation, and also the horrible treatment that people that are unable to work or unable to work enough to be able to make ends meet is it is very welcome to have somebody of your stature, sir, taking on this issue. I'm an economist, so I look at the costs. We know that we have had a number of models in place, and two of them appeared in '86 with the MacDonald Royal Commission, and then in 1993 by House. Each of them had very, very low rates of guaranteed incomes. And most recently, an economist colleague of mine, Reese Kesselman from the Simon Fraser University, costed a guaranteed annual income at $11,000. Which isn't a whole lot of money. It's less than $1,000
per person
for 3.5 million people in this country. So I don't know what figures you had in mind, but that model, that incredibly modest model, is completely unaffordable. It would require not only scrapping all the programs that we have in place, as Andrew mentioned, and some of those would mean that people that are receiving OAS and GIS would get $4,000 to $5,000 less than they currently get. But it would also mean raising taxes by 25 percentage points. And you can't raise taxes on the richest by another 25 percentage points, which means you're going to stick it to the middle class so that you can help the bottom. And I guess at the end of the day, the point is our money better spent, instead of giving it on income, making it easier for people to participate through childcare, through more affordable housing? If you don't do anything about the housing side of it, you give people more money, it just goes in one pocket and out the other pocket if you don't do rent control.
Okay, let me go to Ottawa. Glenn Hodgson, you're also an economist. Give us your take on the guaranteed annual income and how you see it.
Well, first of all, I'll join Armin in saying Senator Siegel's showing really important leadership on this file, has been for a long time. I wrote a kind of an innocent commentary about a year ago musing about this, and I think we should separate between the financial costs and the economic costs or benefits. I'm really interested in knocking the welfare wall down, getting rid of disincentives for people to get back in the workplace. Our starting point is that our growth potential for our economy is going to decline over the next 5 to 10 years. We're used to living in a world of 3.5% growth. We're now entering a world of growth of around 2%, but with a $14 billion fiscal deficit in a province like Ontario. So somehow we have to put our thinking caps on and come up with a lot more creative way of providing income support, encouraging people to re-enter the workforce, to try and revitalize the energy of our economy. And for me, frankly, all ideas should be on the table right now. I don't think we should use arithmetic on sort of one piece of analytics as a way to take the idea of a GIA off the table. I think we really have to sort of roll up our sleeves and examine both the direct financial costs, but really the economic benefit of having higher labor force attachment, of getting rid of the welfare wall, of the savings we can reap in our healthcare system by having people more engaged in the workforce and the economy, are all things we have to examine, not just the arithmetic on the cost of the GI, but really the totality of impacts, both positive and negative, of being much more creative as we design social policy.
The Canadian forces entered Afghanistan in 2001. It has been a long, bloody mission, a combat mission, far removed from our previous peacekeeping roles. Our next guest says Canada's mission in Afghanistan was a moral one, and he says now is not the time to give up the fight. Joining us now, Major Ray Wiss. He's the author of A Line in the Sand, Canadians at War in Afghanistan, and he also served in Afghanistan, and we're really happy to have you here at TVO tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Well, this is an obvious question. So why do this?
Well, because I read a great deal about the war in Afghanistan even before it started. As a former officer in the CF, I was interested in world affairs and followed our mission there very closely. And the more I read, the more I became convinced that this was an example of a very rare thing, a moral war, and one that I was very proud that Canada was participating in, and one that finally I felt I had to do my part in as well.
Okay, but there are, how old are you?
I'm 53 now.
There are young, no kidding. There are younger guys who could handle this.
Sure.
So.
Well, but if you believe in something, it really doesn't matter how old you are. You want to participate, you want to do your part. And I did. I didn't want to sit this one out. I want to be able to tell my daughters, when they're old enough to read about the people who attacked us on 9/11, when they're old enough to read about men who murder little girls who want to go how to learn how to read and write, that their daddy did what he could to stop them. That's important to me.
Let me ask you about the dichotomy of being both a doctor and a soldier. And again, I'm not going to pretend you haven't heard this question before. I'm sure you've thought a lot about it. But,
Sure.
you know, a soldier's job sometimes is to kill people. A doctor's job all the time is to save people. How do you walk that tightrope?
Well, when the bullets are flying, the job for my medics and I, anybody in the medical soldiering business, is to win the fight and to help push the enemy back. And as soon as that's been accomplished, we revert back to our medical role. And it doesn't matter who's wounded, friend, enemy, civilian, I'm there to treat people. And that's my primary mission, and I'll do it as well as I can. There is no dichotomy there. I'm a Canadian soldier who is accomplishing the mission my country set for me. And part of that mission involves fighting, and part of that mission involves healing, and I'll do them both.
They are vivid, sometimes chilling descriptions of the lives of German soldiers during World War II, all brought to life in secretly recorded transcripts of German POWs. I want to just pluck a typical conversation out here, and I want to read an excerpt from the book. So here are two German soldiers, bugged, having a conversation. Here's Müller. When I was at Kharkiv, the whole place had been destroyed except the center of the town. It was a delightful town, a delightful memory. Everyone spoke a little German. They'd learnt it at school. At Taganrog, too, there were splendid cinemas and wonderful cafes on the beach. We did a lot of flying near the junction of the Don and the Dönitz. It's a beautiful country. I traveled everywhere in a lorry. Everywhere we saw women doing compulsory labor service. The other man, Faust, how frightful. Müller again. They were employed on road making, extraordinarily lovely girls. We drove past, simply pulled them into the armored car, raped them, and threw them out again. And did they curse? He just sort of, right, in conversation, points out that, yeah, we raped them and on we go. What did that conversation tell you?
I mean, obviously there were two young men talking to each other. So there is an element of masculinity, an element of, look, I'm a really good man, and we had the power of raping women, and I'm have this sexual energy. The interesting thing is that the other guy didn't complain about that. The other guy, the reaction of the other guy is not, I mean, you're a war criminal, you can't do this. So for the other guy, he accepted that.
It was all normal.
It was all normal. There was no astonishment about that. And that's quite interesting. So it tells you something about their frame of reference again. What is normal, what is unnormal. If he had said, we killed the women, then probably the reaction would have been different, because it was quite clear that if you were killing women and children, this was something different. But the raping...
But rape, they were entitled to.
Yeah. The raping was typical, and also when there were a lot of prostitutes, and they're comparing even the prices and even their experiences of that, and even they integrate the raping into their conversations. I mean, we don't know if this raping story was really true, but the interesting thing is that they were able to express it.
Mm-hmm. It gives you some insight into their thinking.
Yeah.
The reference in here to Kharkiv, meaning they were in Ukraine, meaning these soldiers were probably on the eastern front of World War II, which was horrendous, right? Just brutal. How much do you think they knew about the Nazi war machine against the Soviet Union, a war of total annihilation, all of that?
I mean, you could ask the question, how much do they know, and how much are they aware that this was a war of annihilation? I think, obviously, the experience of the German soldiers serving on the Eastern Front, 10 million soldiers served on the Eastern Front, when they experienced that it was a very brutal war, and so on and so on. Interestingly, they never used that phrase, war of annihilation. For us, it's quite clear, Second World War, especially Eastern Front, was a war of annihilation. But why didn't they use that phrase? Because it's interesting, like these two guys, for them, it was nice to be in the Ukraine, they had fun, they enjoyed themselves.
Enjoyed the cinemas.
Yeah, enjoyed the cinemas. Everybody speaks a little German, how nice it was. And for them, for their immediate social experience, it was not a war of annihilation. And even if they witnessed it, for example, mass executions, the reaction was, oh, it's awful, but they don't go further. They don't say, well, if we killing 10,000s, hundreds of thousands of Jews, this must be a criminal regime. This must be a criminal institution, the Wehrmacht. I have to do something against it. No, they just exchange their experience and then they stop. And then they come back to gossip again, probably.
You spent some time for your book in the Ottawa hospital, and you saw what came through the door. What kind of patients did you see?
Well, first of all, it, like many other big city hospitals, is an acute care hospital, and it's also a teaching hospital. And our system, put it this way, is a triangle, at the top of which are acute care facilities for acute care patients. That's heart attacks, you and I have get in a car accident, people who have deeply chronic and serious diseases. And the system actually works quite well for those people. Fortunately for society, that's only a minority of the people, but nevertheless it works well. The system gets weaker the further away from the acute care you get, because the wait times get unacceptably long. We have the longest wait times, according to these studies I was citing, in the world. So the accessing the system becomes much more difficult when you move down the chain. So what I saw in the acute care hospital was, on the one hand, extremely talented, dedicated, and trained professionals, nurses, doctors, other staff, and even hated administrators. And so I was reassured that at the top of the food chain, things are good. The problem was this acute care hospital was being asked to do a whole bunch of things that acute care hospitals shouldn't have to do. Namely that you go, as I did, and spend a day in the emergency, and see, we've known about this for years, and you ask patients, why are you here? They're not on crutches, they're not coming in ambulances. They're people with colds and cuts and stuff like that. They should be in a family clinic. You say, why are you here? Don't have a family doctor. Family clinic was closed. Feel safer in the hospital because this is a full service hospital if something goes wrong. Then at the other end, they have a monitor on the screen so you can track this every day. 13% of the patients every hour of every day are the frail elderly who should not be there. But they're there because there's no long-term care, there's not enough nursing care, and they're too frail to go home. Everybody talks about home care, which is a very important thing to have more of in our system, but a lot of these people had dementia, they had a chronic series of conditions. Their family was kind of at the end of their tether. They really couldn't go home, but there was no facilities. So they're lying at a $1,300 a day bed instead of at a nursing home, which would have been $300 or $400. And then spend a day in the operating rooms, bowled over by the skill of the surgeons. But there's 100 rooms there. 4 of them are open 24/7 for emergencies. The other 96 open at 8 and close at 4. 5 days a week, not 7, 5. So 2/3 roughly of the operating room time available in a 24/7 week, there are no patients and the rooms are closed. And you kind of look at that and say, wait a minute, there's all this unmet demand, witness to which are wait times for non-acute surgeries, and over here is all this unused supply. What is that?
So why aren't they getting together?
Because we can't price any surgeries in our system, and because the hospitals were given global budgets and they had to fit people into it. Now, to be fair, in Ontario, they're changing the formula whereby hospitals will be rewarded for processing more patients. This is a system that was introduced in other countries years ago. We're now catching up. It's a better formula. It's going to lower the wait times, although the cost might go up because you're doing more surgeries. But the one thing that struck me is, what are hip and knee replacements being done in a hospital, fighting for OR space with neurosurgery and other complicated surgery? They should be in a clinic over here, run privately by the orthopods, who would organize the clinic. The access would be fast. The quality would be as good. The state would pay. The state would pay. It's a private delivery of a publicly paid service. And what's this system for? Is it for ideology or is it for patients? I say it's for patients, and I'm agnostic, frankly, on a lot of the points for which others take a deep ideological view.
Is the state agnostic on this kind of thing?
No, the state is, generally speaking, very hot. Well, it depends on the province, in fairness. But in this province, traditionally, the governments have been extremely hostile to what I just said. Now, other countries have moved to that model, and I'm not preaching for that as the solution to all the problems, but I'm not discarding it either. The problem is that all kinds of interests and ideologues have said This is against the spirit and the law. And the law is the Canada Health Act, or one law, and it clearly says the system should be publicly administered. It doesn't say publicly delivered. And in fact, the civil servants who wrote a manual talking about what each clause meant, which I was able to get a copy of, specifically say that private medicine is allowed under a publicly administered program. And Monique Bégin, who's the author of the Canada Health Act, I spent hours with her, and she would agree with, I believe, everything I've just said. But this has been, for political reasons, I think, more than anything else, or ideological reasons, construed as meaning that everything has to be delivered by the state, by public employees, and anything delivered privately is against the principles and the law, and both of those affirmations are incorrect.
Okay, let me state the obvious here. We do not have anybody from the Ontario Hospital Association, the Ontario Nurses Association, the Ontario Medical Association. Well, I decided let's not go with the typical stakeholders who will defend their turf and all of that kind of stuff here. We wanted to go with three wise and witty observers, and so we've gone a different route here. But let me put this to you. Do unions have a case, Mike, when they say you can't put those procedures that we've been talking about into private settings because you can't control quality and you can't control price, and at the end of the day, you can't be sure that the employees are going to be the best ones possible?
No, that's absolutely false. I think there's plenty of models out there, as small as they are in Canada. Shouldice is a private hospital that has a quality agenda that's second to none in terms of their outcomes. I think sizing and scoping for surgical centers to be standalone facilities where they do nothing but a single surgery or just a few is incredibly efficient. It's a known fact that the outcomes are much better if you have doctors doing just one or two procedures and the nurses doing one or two procedures. It's incredibly efficient. They can get more done. And obviously we have a regulator in Ontario to ensure that the quality and the safety aspect of these facilities are appropriate and protective of the citizens that go and get these procedures done in these facilities. And frankly, we need to see more of this because it is more efficient, and partially because I believe the public system needs a comparator. I think they need to be shown that there's competition in town now, that in fact they need to pull their socks up to do a better job, and what better way of doing it than demonstrating that there's other ways of doing it. As long as the public don't have to pay out of pocket or jump the queue, I think it's the wave of the future.
Carolyn, what's your view on that?
Well, let me put this into perspective a little bit. Sure, there are things that can be done in specialized clinics outside hospitals. We see it, we've seen it in Canada, we see it in other advanced countries. Expecting too much from that particular route would be a mistake. Britain has experimented with so-called independent sector treatment centers. They thought, this was introduced under a Labour government, under Tony Blair. They expected within about 4 years, 15% of elective surgery would be done in those clinics. It was about 3%. Now, you know, the current reforms are pushing it harder, but there is a limit. That the expenses in our system are not driven by hips and knees and cataracts. I mean, those, if we can reduce those costs, sure, we will reduce health costs overall. But really, really sick people drive the health costs in our system. And specialized clinics are not the answer for treating really, really sick people.
Really sick people,
correct.
meaning somebody who's 85
Yeah, I
in
mean,
bed for 6 months.
30% roughly of the costs are driven by 1 or 2% of the patients.
Yeah.
And frankly, if you asked me, here's $1, Jeff Simpson, spend it to improve the healthcare system, I'd never put it in the healthcare system. I'd put it into reducing poverty. Because poor people access the system because their health is worse, and therefore they put more of a strain on the system by far than people who are affluent. Now, that discussion about income inequality is a much more complicated discussion to have, and it's very long term. And the problem, if you're an elected official, is the public wants, you mentioned earlier in our discussion, you quoted me saying contradictory. The public wants more now, but they don't want to pay any more now in either taxes or certainly not user fees. So that's what I mean by contradictory. So the political person who hears the good sense of what I think we would all agree is the right thing to do in terms of reducing the long-term costs on the healthcare system is to get more people out of poverty, says that's all fine. That's great. We're a terrific objective, except that I got an election here in 4 years' time. And I need to show results. And results are more services, more this, more that, and so on and so forth, because that's what my constituents want.
For years, the Celtic Tiger was a force to be reckoned with. It was far removed from the hard times its people had lived through and the diaspora it had delivered. Ireland was transformed from one of Europe's poorest nations into one of its wealthiest. But then came the financial crisis and the ensuing EU bailout. Today, the Emerald Isle remains undaunted, and the country's government is confident Ireland will exit its bailout program by next year, led by a strong exports and jobs strategy. Let's bring some numbers up here, because the youth unemployment in Ireland since 2002 has, of course, gone up a lot. Here's our bar graph. You can see it over my shoulder here. Let's just bring this up. You can see what's happened from January 02 up to January of 2010. That's youth unemployment, and that is just staggering. The result, of course, is that lots of young people leave. And I'm wondering, for starters, how do you get these people back?
Well, I think we drive the economic recovery. I think we realise that we're in a period of transformation, and we have to rebuild the economy and the new sectors. But I suppose if you look historically, in the 80s we had a very high emigration as well. But many of those people came back with new skills in the 90s to build the strong economy that you mentioned in your opening remarks, which was the envy of many a country. So often emigration in the short term, it is a huge disappointment. As a parent, you're always very disappointed to see someone having to leave. But many of those people have come back with new skills, new partnerships, and they've helped to drive the economy. So our ambition would be, as we work on the program of correction, as we rebuild the new sectors, that we will have a strong economy and people will come back with new skills, with new experiences, and help build that.
That sounds like a decade, if not longer, project though, right?
Well, I don't think it would be quite so far away. I mean, we have already returned to growth. So unlike most of Europe, we are now in positive territory. We're seeing the beginnings of recovery of private sector employment. So I think we have to build on that, and it's the government's ambition to create a net 100,000 jobs by 2016, and we continue to be confident that that will be reached. So I think the strategy is there. We have developed a plan right across government seeking to drive ambitious targets, ambitious reforms, and I think those are working. So it will take time, we recognise that, but I believe that we will see people come back. Obviously not all of them will come back. Some of them will marry beautiful Canadian women perhaps, and that will be the end of the Green Isle for them.
We've already heard the expression fiscal cliff a few times on this program, and over the next 7 weeks we're going to hear it, if we watch the media or read magazines or newspapers, thousands of times. And I want to get a sense from Mike, start us off again if you would. This Congress has to come to grips with this fiscal cliff, we're told, by the end of the year, or else. What kind of confidence do you have in Australia that they're going to figure this out?
Well, we're hoping, we're praying that they do figure it out. But one of the concerns, I think, is that if they just push the can down the road, if they go for a temporary, just delay the tax increases, put it off. Because I think one of the major problems that the world's facing now, and the US is facing, is uncertainty. That's holding things back. People aren't investing, people aren't consuming because of uncertainty. Political gridlock is causing that uncertainty. Now, what the US needs, it needs to avoid the fiscal cliff, can't have the massive contraction from withdrawing the fiscal impulse, but it does need to have a credible fiscal consolidation plan. Apart from the fiscal cliff, the other concern that we saw with the debt ceiling last year, the lifting of the debt ceiling, is a concern about the sustainability, potential sustainability of the US fiscal position. Can it pay its bills if it has this massive debt? So it's got to get this balance right between avoiding the cliff, but getting in a credible plan and do it and build some confidence. Now, we're all hoping and relying that good sense is going to break out between the Democrats and the Republicans.
How often does that happen?
Well, this is the worry, isn't it?
Bestman, when you look at it, you've got a Senate that seems impossibly deadlocked, you've got the House still in the hands of the Republicans, and you've got a president who, while getting a good victory in the Electoral College, frankly won by 1%.
Yeah.
What are those the elements of a solution?
Well, you know, it's really it's a country that's obviously very polarized at the moment, and part of that is because there's two conversations going simultaneously, and unfortunately, I think there isn't a lot of meeting of minds on this issue. But you know, I think it's a global problem. There are two debates out there. One on how much austerity is right, it's too much of it is not a good thing, and how much stimulus is needed in order to kickstart these economies. And we've been dealing with this challenge for the past 5 years in practically every country. How much is too much of one or the other? And I think that the United States, you know, we've just entered or just finished 4 years of Obama where the stimulus track was tried, as well here as in Canada. And now I think we're reverting back to that push to bring in more of that austerity now that hopefully we've sort of you know, gone through the worst of the Great Recession. But you know, it's a challenge throughout the entire globe, and I think policymakers don't have an easy task on how to exactly position themselves on that.
I'm actually going to quote you a little bit more, because you've got this piece on the CG Online website at cgonline.org, in which you say, and let's bring this up for everybody to look at it, at the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and World Bank Group annual meetings in Tokyo, we saw a very exciting and relevant debate that meeting participants will not soon forget. Fiscal consolidation, or budget cutting to get in line with incomes, was a key buzzword. While there was often little disagreement on the need for fiscal consolidation, at least among those speaking in Tokyo, the pace and specificity of these cuts was indeed debated and contested. So let's get into this a bit more. Cyrus, on the issue of the debate that the world is having on whether we need more austerity or more stimulus, where are you?
Well, again, I'd like to come at it from the perspective of poor and small and developing countries. I think they've had that discourse themselves for many, many years, actually. I think the austerity, the polarized nature of the way it's presented is something that they've been challenged with for many, many years. They haven't had fiscal space themselves. They have, in many instances, required to satisfy conditionalities which have driven them to adopt austere fiscal stances and curb expenditure. Now, what is very interesting in all of this, and again something that I think came out reasonably well during the conference, is that for those types of countries, they've been through a quite significant period of adjustment themselves. What they're demonstrating now is a certain type of innovation and competitiveness which is allowing countries, for example the ones in sub-Saharan Africa that I mentioned, to find pathways to regenerate growth. I think this is very important, because I think if the fiscal cliff issue is avoided in the US, and if certainty is brought to the direction of the global economy, it will catalyze quite a momentum of higher growth, of job-inducing growth in developing countries.
It's a huge if. That's a huge if.
It's a huge if, but what is important about the if is that if it doesn't happen, innovation is already happening in the poorest of developing countries. Innovation is happening, South-South collaboration is happening, South-South trade is ramping up already right now. And this is not at all to suggest that they should try to de-link in any way from traditional markets. But the reality of these countries is that their trade base is starting to diversify, become much more nuanced, much more calibrated to where competition can be sustained. 30% of least developed countries' merchandise exports today, of the poorest countries of the world and of the small vulnerable economies of the world, is now going to emerging markets. So there are other types of self-sustaining dynamics that are starting to take place in this multipolar global environment. If, a big if, but if global uncertainty starts to alleviate, it sets up for a really very promising future prognosis for many, many developing countries. I think that's a very valuable forward-looking prospect for the type of dynamism that's coming, broadly one says from the South, but from developing countries as a whole.
Inga, let me ask you, it's a very hopeful prognosis. Does it have any basis in reality?
I think it has a basis in reality because it's happening. So that is clearly a reality. But I wanted to come back, if I may, to a point that Gordon made earlier, that the EU is in a mess. One can see it, the EU being in a mess, but one can also put a positive spin on it. because we were in a mess all along, only we had covered it up. We had introduced the euro too early, too politically, and now we are building the institutions that we need in order to really have a sound euro in the future. So I think we have to sort of learn to have a little patience and tolerance for transformation and for change, and not just see it as being messy and disturbing, but moving forward.
Well, it's a mess, but at least you're dealing with the mess now.
Yeah, that's good.
That's progress.
And my second point concerns the fiscal cliff. I think sound fiscal policy, it goes without saying. And I'm quite optimistic that the US will manage, because since 2 days I'm reading in the Financial Times that business wants it. So if business is behind it, maybe the Republicans and the Democrats will come together. But what worries me is that we are focusing on fiscal cliff, fiscal cliff, fiscal cliff. Fiscal cliff, this fiscal cliff will be a blip in the history books, if any at all, in future. But the environmental cliff is there to destroy the planet. So how come a few days ago we had this hurricane and everything is in shambles, and we don't sit here and talk about the environmental cliff? Then there is a third cliff, and that's the equity cliff. You should see the income statistics, how they are moving apart, and income distribution becoming more and more inequitable within countries, the richer countries, including Germany, and in Africa. So we really have to ask this question: how do we avoid the environmental cliff? How do we avoid the social cliff that we already see bubbling? And then compared to that, I think the fiscal cliff is doable.
Gordon, which of the three cliffs do you want to jump off first?
Well, first of all, let me make clear that on the European Union, the real story is what an enormous amount has been achieved over the last 5 decades. And remembering that at the origin of the European Union was to create a security community so France and Germany could never go back to war. The building of Europe has been a difficult process, a strange process, I would say, because the leaders get out ahead, there's a crisis, and then there's a reaction to it. But so you've got to understand that what the Europeans are trying to do is very complicated, and they're trying to do it with more countries, more and more countries, and that makes it complicated. So I don't want it all to leave the impression that the European Union isn't a success, but dealing with this particular set of problems, for the reasons I think we've discussed here, is proving to be a huge challenge.
I want to thank all of you for coming around our table today here at TVO and to discuss these very important issues. Mike Callahan, Executive Director of the Australian Treasury's International Division. Cyrus Rustamji, Director of the Commonwealth Secretariat's Economic Affairs Division. Inga Cowell from the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin, Germany. Besma Momani, Senior Fellow at CG. Gordon Smith, Distinguished Fellow at CG. Thanks so much, everybody.
That is the Agenda's Week in Review, and you can see all of those programs in their entirety on our website, theagenda.tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.